This is Diana Sullivan in Austin, Texas. This is a video of techniques from this particular Afghan, the long triangles short row graphics Afghan. It's part of my An Afghan in a Day or Less series, and it's available as a digital pattern over at www.dianaknits.com. Now this Afghan, by using short row graphics, gives you a very striking geometric pattern, but you do not have to take the time and fuss with intarsia. It's fast and easy. It also has hems all around, which gives you extra width and very sturdy edges. Edges on blankets seem to get the most wear. We also have a very interesting corner detail on this Afghan. Let's get started with the technique. I am putting a hem on this swatch. This is the hem you would use to go around a blanket with corner emblems. And to do this hem, I'm going to work with the pearl side of the swatch toward me, and I'm going to use a triple transfer tool. Now, I have already brought some needles into B position, and to save myself time, I'm using a cut credit card, and I'm just sliding along, opening all of those hooks. That makes this just a little easier. Now let's see where to put the tool. As I unroll and look at the edge of the knitting, I am going to go one stitch from the edge and put my tool in, and I can flip it over this first time and make sure that I am one stitch from the edge. That is 2 strands above the hook, and I put that on the first 3 needles. Now, I am going to skip a hole. Looking at this from the wrong side, you can see the row of holes, especially if you stretch it downward, and especially on this bulky machine. It's one of the advantages of practicing on a bigger needle size, is that you can really see some of these details. Anyway, here are the 3, and I'm skipping that one, so my tool goes in the next 3. And it goes on the next 3 needles. Now, pick up 3 rows and skip 1 is a very typical ratio for picking up button bands and hems and all kinds of things that happen along the side edge of your knitting. That's because this will be about the right number of stitches to go with that number of rows, and it won't pull in too much or droop too much or wave. It'll work. And how do you figure things out? Well, like that, you simply do some swatches before you dive into a project, especially if you don't have directions to follow. So here I am picking them up all the way across the side. Once my needles have been inserted into the side edge of the knitting, I like to take a moment and check my work. I have put a couple of weights on here, or I could pull down with my hands. And I'm looking right along there and making sure that I have a straight line, that I'm exactly 1 stitch in. Let's see, and if something doesn't look right to me, this is the moment to fix it. There we go. So I like that. That is straight, and that means I will have a good looking hem. Now this next thing is a tip for you. Most people don't do this, but I think it really saves me time and aggravation. I bring my needles out to hold. You don't have to do this if your hem is an entirely different color from your knitting, but in my case, I have some white and then some mixture here, and then some blue. And my hem's going to be blue, and I need, later on, to be able to see what to pick up when I pick up the hem, when I fold it and finish it. So, to make that easier, I have a contrasting color of ravel cord. Only this isn't ravel cord, this is some smooth yarn. It's pink, and it is really going to be easy for me to see the pink compared to the blue and the white. So I'm just running this thread over and under these needles, which are pulled all the way out toward me. This is going to make the most terrific marker row and make it much easier to pick the hem up. You'll see. So I'm putting a clothespin on this because I want it to hang down, and the other side is hanging down pretty well because it's still attached to the cone, which is sitting on the floor. My hems are the same tension as the knitting in the center, so I've left my machine on that number, and my hems are 12 rows deep, and your hems could be a different depth, but it's the same technique. I like to add some width to my blankets by putting a nice sturdy hem on, and I'm going to do those 12 rows now. The hems on my swatch are picot hems, and every other stitch is going to be transferred to its neighbor. However, you don't want to transfer an end stitch, so I'm not transferring the last stitch here on the right. I have 2 stitches back here, and I'm going to do that quickly. This is a little shortcut. I'm using a 7-stitch transfer tool, and I've adjusted it so that every other prong is down. That allows me to transfer 4 at once. You can also make transfers like this easier by using a slanted object like the credit card to open the latches on the needles on the bed, as well as the latches that are pulled out. The pulled out latches, of course, tend to be open, but it doesn't hurt to make sure they're all open. Just a little time saver for you. What I just knitted was the outside of hem, and now I'm going to knit the inside of the hem, 12 more rows. I removed the hardware, and it's time to pick up the hem. This is where that ravel cord is going to be handy. I zoomed in so I can show you exactly where to pick up. This pink cord is going through blue stitches. It goes through it in one direction, the next stitch it goes through in the other direction. And I know exactly what stitch to pick up. I start with the second because the bottom of hems is always 1 stitch less than the top of hems. And whether the ravel cord is over or under your tool doesn't matter, but you would prefer not to split your ravel cord. It'll be easier to get out later if you don't split it. Or any of the other yarn. I'm trying to get that ravel cord and not split it. And this one, just want the exact spot where that yarn went through. Now that makes it really easy to see what to pick up. You might be saying to yourself, well, she doesn't need that. Obviously, over here, she's going to pick up the blue loops. Yep, you're right. However, pretty soon I'm going to be picking up the blue loops that are in front of the blue knitting, and then it gets hard to tell what to pick up. Now here's where that really comes in handy. Now I have to pick up the blue loops that are coming out of the blue knitting. Not so easy to see, and yet if I just put my tool in the loop that ravel cord is going through, that is what I pick up. So, of course, lots of people just pick up whatever looks like it might be the right loop, and you know, you could usually get away with that. but I like to do it this way. This way I don't miss any. I should come out with exactly the right number of pickups so that my hem is not pulled to one side. And I like things that make it easy to knit. Now, if I didn't split the ravel cord, it should slip right out. But guess what? It doesn't. Here's a trick for that. First of all, I'm using ravel cord that I don't mind cutting because it isn't that precious tiny bit of ravel cord that came with the machine. And I'm pulling it right and left and looking to see which needle wiggles. This needle right here wiggles. Just betcha I can get all the ravel cord to the right of that needle just by pulling, because that's where I split the yarn. Now I could unsplit the yarn just by lifting it over that needle and pull it out, and it is pulling out. Or I could take a sharp pair of scissors, give that a little snip, and pull it out that way. So your ravel cord is out, and now you can use any bind off you want. You can either use a needle and bind off through 2 stitches, or you can do a quick loop through a loop bind off like me, because I do a lot of blankets, and this blanket that I'm doing the technique for is part of my Afghan in a Day or Less series. A lot of us love to knit for children and for relatives and for rest homes, and we don't want these Afghans to take forever. So a few tricks along the way seems like the thing to do. Now I have just brought my needles into hold. I'm getting something to make it easier to do a very loose row. Now if this was a tight piece of fabric, on a low tension I could add 5 or 6 numbers to the tension dial and knit a loose row and do the loop through a loop bind off. But I can't get it loose enough. So I have a ruler that happens to be 2 centimeters, about 3/4 of an inch wide, and it's a stitch gauge ruler. It's a nifty object all of its own, but you could certainly cut yourself a strip of poster board 3/4 of an inch wide, or you could look around and see what you've got that might work. And I am going to use it to hand knit the stitches back. I'm going to need some loose yarn, so I'm pulling a whole bunch of yarn down. I have lots of loose yarn now, and it's just not being held up at all by the upper tension unit. So I know I need that. And then I'm taking this ruler and I'm putting it all the way back, right over the rivets at the back of the needle bed. Now I am going to push my needles almost all the way back. I'm going to watch the latches while I push. So as I push them back and they rub up against the previous knitting, the latches begin to close. And once the latches begin to close, I take this loose yarn and lay it inside. The latches are going to form a tunnel. Now I just keep tapping my needles back a little at a time until they close right over this yarn. And then I tap them back fairly hard. And this yarn is running through here like a tunnel. I'm going to get in close and show you that. For instance, if I take one of my tools and I pull this yarn, you see how it flows freely in there? Of course, I'm going to tighten that back up, but that yarn is going to flow freely from the long drapey loose end on the left-hand side. I've just got this pile of yarn on the floor, over to the right-hand side where I'm going to start knitting the stitches through. As I knit the stitches through, this is really easy. I'm just going to use my right thumb. So I push the first needle back so that it taps that ruler, and I'm going to use my left hand and just keep the ruler from popping up. And then I'll take my thumb and push the second one back But while I do it, I push on the first one's needle butt, because what that does is it keeps it from taking some of the yarn from the previous hook. It keeps it measured. I don't have to estimate how far back to push these. I just go bump right up against my ruler, and they will be all alike, which makes me happy. And it's done. Look how quickly I was able to knit all of those through. Let's have a look at this. I'll just take my little ruler and move it. And I will bring my needles forward with weight on the work, because if I have no weight on that work, those loops might pop off. I'll just keep bringing these forward, all the way forward. And you can see how nicely alike my loose loops are, and how wonderfully loose my loose loops are. Tongue twister. So I'll push these back, and I will use a latch tool and latch them off. Before I latch them off, I cut this yarn on the left, so I'll have a short tail, and I start opposite the tail. So if the tail's on the left, I start on the right. And I pull the first loop off, and I slip my tool backward into the second loop. I want the old loop to be below the latch, the new loop to be inside the latch, and I pull the second loop through the first loop. Go to the third one, same thing. Old loop down below the latch, and I can quickly pull a loop through a loop right on across the work. I learned this from a friend. She was using a stick to do this. She had a stick that was just about right. And I have a ruler. I think my ruler wouldn't be quite right for my standard gauge machine, but this ruler lives by my bulky machine because it's quite good for the bulky machine. I've pulled my last loop, and then I pulled my loose end through my last loop. Here's the hem that I just put on. Now, take some sort of object, a hand knitting needle, a chopstick, a ruler, something, put it in there and give it a little tug, and that will just set the stitches a little bit. I also reach in and I unroll it a little bit. Now if I flip this over, you can see how straight this edge is and how nice that looks, and how much this hem matches the hem on the top or the bottom. So that's how to put the hem along the side of something. Now if you have a big blanket and you need two hems to cover a side, what you do is you pick up as many stitches as you can and you put a hem in, and then you add one stitch where you're going to have a seam before you start knitting the rows of the hem. And then you do that again, picking up stitches on the remaining rows, and add a stitch for a hem there, and then you do a one stitch mattress stitch here to join the two hems. It'll be quite invisible, and you might want to review your mattress stitch, but you should be able to do one that's invisible and use as many hems as you need to put a sturdy edge on the side of a long blanket.